If you're using a Windows computer to remotely manage servers, how do you configure PuTTY and WinSCP, for example, to take advantage of SSH keys for more secure authentication? Well, if that's something you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. Now, I will put a timeline in this video in case there's a particular section you prefer to jump to. Just be aware that we're actually going to be using this PuTTY client throughout the video. So here we are on the actual PuTTY download website, because that's the first thing I need to do is to actually download the software in the first place. And I do have choices. I mean, I can download the individual executable files because they're all standalone. But the easiest way for me really, I think, is just to download the entire installation package, because it's not just PuTTY itself that we need, we also need puttygen. So PuTTY is what we'll use to actually connect to the SSH server, and puttygen is what we'll use to actually create the SSH keys that PuTTY itself can use. So the most popular processor these days is going to be a 64-bit processor anyway, so not surprisingly I'm going to click on this 64-bit version of PuTTY. So we'll click on that link and then we'll click on save to download the software. Now that that's downloaded, we'll just go to Explorer, we'll double click on our file. Not really a great deal to answer here, so I'm just going to click on next. I'm going to leave the default settings for where the actual folder gets installed as is, but you can change this, put the actual file somewhere else if you'd prefer. In my case, I'm just going to leave it as is. I'll click on next. I'm going to leave these settings as is as well, and I'll click on install. And then that brings up the user account control just to make sure you do actually want to install this software. So I do, so I'm going to click on yes. Then that installs the software, and that's pretty much it. I'm going to deselect that option to view the README file, and instead I'm just going to click on finish. Now I do want some shortcuts for the actual executable, so I'm just going to minimize my browser here. Then I'm going to go over to the C drive, over to program files, and over to PuTTY. So this is the default location where the software gets installed. If you have changed that location, then obviously that's where you need to go next. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a copy of that executable. So this is the actual PuTTY software itself, and I'm going to paste a shortcut onto my desktop to make my life a bit easier. And I'm going to do the same with puttygen. So I'll copy that and paste a shortcut. So I've now got the actual two shortcuts on my desktop. So what I can do is I can actually now start connecting to SSH servers using PuTTY. But this video is all about SSH keys. So that's the next thing we need to start doing, is to actually create SSH keys using puttygen. Now, although PuTTY can actually use SSH keys, it can't actually create any. And that's where puttygen comes in. So we need to actually create our public and private key pair. So I'm going to double click on puttygen, and that launches the software. Now by default, it's going to use the RSA algorithm, and it's going to create a key pair 2048 bits. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change the algorithm to EDDSA. The reason I'm doing that is it is a more modern algorithm, uses smaller bit sizes, and that makes it easier, particularly for the public keys, I find. So entirely up to you, which key pair algorithm you want to use. In this case, it just happens to be EDDSA. So the next thing to do is to then click on generate, and as it says, it wants you to move the mouse around, and that's just basically because it needs some sort of randomness, some random data from somewhere to then create the actual keys. So it didn't take that long to do. And next thing I'm going to do in that case is change this comment. You can put whatever you like in here. You can see that the actual comment comes right at the end of the public key itself. What you put in here is up to you, but I'm just going to put something in here that makes it easy for me to identify that this is the Windows key for Fred. Now, what I will do then is put an actual key phrase in as well. I just need to make sure that these match, although it won't actually tell me, I must admit, until I actually try to save the actual private key. But the reason for doing this is it's just based on the security model of something you have and something you know. It makes it more secure than a username and password, for example. If I've got the private key, but I don't know the passphrase, then I can't use it. Now I could leave that blank, but that's not really recommended. I mean, you could do it if you're doing, say, like automation, for example. You're using SSH keys to connect to other computers and you've got some automated task, in which case you can't use a passphrase against that private key, because every time you want to run that actual software, you need to put the actual key passphrase in. So it doesn't make any sense for automation. But for user keys where you're logging in as an individual manually, then you definitely want to be using an actual key. Certainly something a lot more stronger and more complicated than I'm using. I'm just trying to do this for the sake of keeping the video simple. But use a password manager, something that will create a longer, more complicated password than this. And then the idea is, if somebody does get a hold of your private key, which you really want to keep safe and secure, then that person would actually need to know what the actual passphrase is to be able to use it. On the other hand, if there's no passphrase against it, yes, it makes your life easier for logging in, but it's less secure. So for that reason, I would always recommend using a passphrase here. So the next thing we need to do is to actually save the key pair. So down here, we've got an option to save the public key. So I'll click on that. And what it does, it just remembers the last place that Explorer happened to be. What you call this is entirely up to you. I'm just going to keep things kind of consistent for what I've been doing in a previous video using Linux, for example. Where I use OpenSSH, it tends to put on a .pub extension to the actual name of the actual key itself. So I'm just keeping that consistent. So in my case, it's fredkey.pub. I'm going to click on save. Then I'm going to click on save private key. Now, in this case, the actual password I put in and the confirmation of that password matched, so it didn't complain, so that's good. One thing to point out is that it's going to create a file and it has to end with an extension of .ppk. This is the format that gets used by Putty over here. So I'm just going to call this fredkey, for example. Now, it doesn't really matter if I put the .ppk file at the end, it's going to put that on anyway. So if I click on save, if I go over to my documents folder over here, you can see it's already created that file called fredkey.ppk. So whether I put the extension on or not, it was going to save it with that extension. So I've now got two files. I've got a fredkey.ppk. So this is my private key. And you can see Windows recognizes it as a Putty private key file. Whereas this is the private key, the public key rather. So this is the actual key that we need to get onto the actual server in order that we can actually connect using SSH and using the actual key. But we'd also have to configure Putty itself to use it. So next thing we need to do is to actually connect to our actual SSH server and get this public key uploaded. Now, there are different ways that I can actually get that public key onto the server, but because I need to actually create a new file for the user account that the server can use to actually then take advantage of SSH keys, I may as well just copy and paste the contents of that key into the file while I'm creating it. So for that reason, I'm going to launch a new Putty session. Put in the actual IP address of our server. So this is just a test server that I've set up for the video. As you can see, it's by default, it's using SSH to connect, so I can just click on open. Now, because I didn't supply a user, it's actually prompting us for a username. So in my case, it's Fred. Now, one thing to point out is this prompt here, where it's prompting us for Fred's password. So bear in mind, this is going to be different when we're using the actual SSH keys to authenticate. So this is a good way to actually tell whether you're being authenticated against a username and password or against SSH keys. But in any case, I need to supply the actual password for Fred. Just see if that's correct. Yes, it is. So what I now need to do is to create a new folder. So this is a folder where the OpenSSH server is going to actually look for authorized keys. So I'm going to create this new folder and it's called .ssh. So the dot means it's a hidden folder. We're going to switch over to that folder. And the file that it's going to be looking for is called authorized_keys. Just going to double check I've spelled that correctly and hit return. Now, it's called authorized_keys, i.e. plural, because you can actually store multiple public keys in here. The idea is you can have key rotation, for example. And just bear in mind that this file is stored in the user's own folder, meaning that this particular file is only of relevance to Fred here that we're logged in as. Every user has their own home folder, they have their own .ssh folder, their own authorized keys file storing public keys and so on. So that's just something to bear in mind. In any case, I need the actual contents of that public key. So I'm just going to minimize the window there. And I'm going to actually launch puttygen again, because if I open up the public key that we've got here and open that up using Notepad, you can see the contents are somewhat different to what I'd want to put into that actual file. So I'm just going to close that. So if you don't already have puttygen already open, we can just open that private key back up again. So we click on load, point it to our private key. I'll have to supply it with a password or passphrase, if you will, of that actual private key, because that key is now protected, which is exactly what we want. So I'll click OK. And now we've got all of our details back. So I'm just going to copy the entire contents of that public key, because that's what we want. And I'll paste that into our file, so you can see that's what we've got. So I want to save this, so I'm going to exit out, say yes, just save the changes, hit return to say we want to save it in that same file. And that creates our authorized keys file that stores our public key, which means that if we now try to log into this computer and use our private key, the server's actually going to come and look into this folder and into this particular file. It'll generate some random data and it'll encrypt the actual data using the public key that we've got in here. It'll send that back to Putty, and then it's up to our actual, Putty client to then decrypt that actual encrypted random data, and it'll use that to validate that it is the actual, genuine user who's logging in. So the next thing we need to do though is to actually set up Putty to actually use SSH keys. Now when it comes to Putty, you actually need to tell it which private key that you want to use, because by default all it's going to do is, well, try and log in and you'll get prompted for a username and password. You've actually got to configure Putty to reference a private key, which in turn tells the server that you want to use SSH authentication. So I'm just going to paste in my IP address for our test server to make my life a bit easier. We're going to expand out the SSH details here. Then I'm going to go down to this section here, auth. And then now what we need to do is point it to the actual private key we want to use for this session. So I'm going to click on browse. I'm going to point it to the private key that we created and click open. And then if I click open again, you can see we're now connecting in. I didn't supply it with, an actual username to log in with, so we're being prompted for one. So I'll put that in. And now you'll notice that the prompt is different. So like I was saying in a previous section, before we were actually being prompted for an actual password. Now that's the user account and password authentication. Now we're being prompted for the passphrase for the key. So you can tell now that we're actually going through SSH key authentication. So it's a good way to tell a difference between the two is based on whatever that prompt is. So assuming I can put the proper password in, we should be able to authenticate with the actual SSH key now. So there you go, we're now logged in. Now, practically, that's not really good, because it's a case of you're going to have to do that for every session. And chances are you're going to be saving sessions anyway. So if we open Putty back up again, what I could do is I can actually save the key with the session. So I can create a new session. For example, I can call it test1 for the name of the server. But I want to store that private key so that it remembers every time we connect in using that session, it'll always use the private key. So go back down to the SSH again, go back to auth, point it to the private key. So I'll go back up to the session again. Just make sure that's still pointing as test1, and I click save. If I exit out, open Putty again. If we go to our test1 session and then load that in, you can see there's our IP address. Come back down to our auth section. There's our private key. So that's one way to actually get it to remember. I mean, you can make these even easier. I mean, if you want, you can actually store the username in there if you prefer. It's a bit of an extra security risk in that you're giving the actual name of the actual user away, although in my case, to be fair, the actual name of the key kind of gives it away. But that's something to bear in mind, is that you may really not want to be storing the actual the key as part of the session in case that config file, because this all gets stored in config files. It's something that's going to get potentially stolen, for instance, in which case somebody's already got now advantage of knowing what your username is. They still need to know what the actual key phrase is. They still need to have the actual key, but security is always about layers. It's always about making things as difficult as possible. Now, one thing I will point out is that if I have to keep doing this for every server and I've got lots of servers, it's not going to be all that practical. So what I could do, for example, is, well, typically I'm going to probably use the same private key for every server that I connect into. In which case, what I could do is I could save the actual private key as part of the default settings. So if I go to default settings and just load those in, there's nothing there at the minute, but if I go down to the SSH section again, go down to auth, point it to the private key, and then tell it to use that private key. If I go back to my session, point it to the default settings and click save, it'll come out again just to show you that it's being saved. So we'll load PuTTY back up again. If we come down to SSH, down to auth, it's now stored as part of the default session. So that's quite useful, that I find. So again, if I just have to type the name of the IP address of this server, 172.16.17.19 rather, not 229. If I just click open now, again, get prompted to log in with our user account, hit return, put the passphrase in. Nope, still get it wrong. Nope, still got it wrong. Maybe I'm just typing it too quick. So there you go. Now, if we launch PuTTY again, that's part of the default session now. So if I actually type in the IP address, put in, say, call that test number 3, for example. Technically the server's called test 1, but just for the sake of this, if we click on that and save it as test 3, I'll come back out again, load PuTTY just for testing this. We'll go to test 3, we'll load that session in, we'll open that up, so we'll log in as Fred. So you can see, because the default session has been configured to use that specific private key, every new session that I create is always going to be using that same private key. So that's a way of making your life easier, I think, by saving that as part of the private key. Saving the private key as part of your default session saves you having to do it for every individual. It's basically, it's one less bit of information to store as part of these individual save sessions. And bear in mind, these sessions you can use them not just specifically in PuTTY. There are other tools like Super PuTTY, for example, that gives you tabbed SSH sessions, for example, and all it does, it just links in with PuTTY that you've got. So any saved sessions in here, you'll be pulling that information out of here. So it does make life a lot easier by saving that as part of the default settings. Now, obviously, if you've got other servers that need different keys, then you would have to change the key for that individual saved session you've got. But to me, I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. So it's relatively easy to actually save that private key and use the authentication using SSH keys, and it's pretty easy to spot the difference. The only thing is, we want to be extra secure. We actually want to stop people being able to log in with the username and password, because if I were to connect from another computer and log in as Fred, without that private key, or without PuTTY set up to use a private key, it's going to go through the same username and password authentication. But I actually want to enforce SSH keys going forward, which means I need to make a change within the server so that it only accepts SSH key authentication going forward. Now, although we've uploaded a public key for Fred, and although we've actually got PuTTY configured to use a private key, which means we can now use SSH key authentication, the trouble is Fred could easily just disable that option within PuTTY, or could log in from a different computer. In fact, anybody who's got an account on this server could just log in and use password authentication, which is not as secure. So we actually want to disable that feature. We want to enforce SSH key authentication. But that needs a change within the actual server itself, which means I've had to log in using an account that's got sudo rights. The alternative would be to, to switch over as the root user, for example, if it was a different Linux distro. But this is Ubuntu, and this user's got sudo rights, so that's what we're doing. So I need to make a change. I need to edit the actual configuration file first. And I'm going to use the nano editor. Entirely up to you what you want to use. But the file is in the /etc/ssh folder. And it's the config file for the SSH daemon. So /etc/ssh/sshd_config is the file we need to change. So I'll hit return, put my password in. Nope, didn't like that. I think it's just because I'm typing things too fast. But when it comes to Ubuntu, one thing I've noticed is that if we go down to here, there it is. This particular line is commented out, which is password authentication, yes, which means allow password authentication. For whatever reason, if you go right to the end, you'll actually find that same line, but it's not commented out. So this is the line that's actually, needs to be changed. So I'm actually going to change that over to say no, which means it's going to refuse password authentication going forward. So we'll save that change. Now what I need to do is restart the actual OpenSSH service. So we'll restart SSH. So I'll just double check that that's restarted. Yep, that's back up and running. So if we now try to connect into the actual server, what I've done is I've actually disabled the default settings. So now when we try to connect in, we'll go through password authentication. So just pasting in the actual IP address to make life a bit easier. I'll click on open. We'll log in as Fred. And there we go. It's refusing access because it's saying public key. We need a public key authentication process to follow through on here. It's just not supported to use password authentication. So what I'll do is I'll launch Putty again. We'll load up our test1 session because that does have the private key. I'll click on open. I'll want to log in as Fred. So now it is prompting us for the key. So hopefully I can get the password right this time. And there you go. So now, as you can see, because I've changed the actual behavior within the config, it's no longer going to allow password authentication. So that's something to bear in mind going forward, is that anybody who now wants to log into this server does need an actual public key uploaded onto the server. The client that they're using needs to be configured to use a private key. That in turn is what prompts the actual server to then use or look for an actual public key as part of the authentication process. But this does make things a lot more secure than just a username and password, because it all boils down to now it's a case of something you have and something you know. Somebody needs to know what the actual passphrase is for this private key, and they actually need to be in possession of this private key in order to now be able to authenticate and get access into that server remotely using SSH. Now, Putty doesn't support OpenSSH keys. That's why we're having to create a special PPK format file for Putty to use. So if you've got a server like this one, for example, and you've already set it up to use OpenSSH keys, then the problem you're going to have is you won't be able to connect unless you make some slight changes. So for example, what I've got at the moment, I've changed the actual authorized key file here. This is actually using a public key that was created on a Linux computer in a previous video. So it's a case of, if I now try to connect using that PPK file that I just created from puttygen, it's not going to work. The private keys and the public keys are completely independent, totally different from one another. So I've got choices. I mean, I could edit the authorized keys file and add in the public key that goes with the private key we created using puttygen to create this ppk file that Putty itself could use. Alternatively, what we can do is actually convert our already existing private key that was created using OpenSSH into a ppk format, and then that makes it compatible with Putty. So if I open up puttygen and then we go to conversions and then tell it to import a key, if I go to my Linux folder here, because this is where I've been storing the actual private key here and the public key from my Linux computer, I'll point it to the private key because that's what we need. Tell it to open, then I need to provide it with the passphrase for that specific private key. As you can see, it does support OpenSSH, so puttygen can actually support OpenSSH. The problem is it's Putty itself that doesn't. So we've now actually got to convert this over into a ppk file that Putty can use. Now, I wouldn't be too concerned about these algorithm settings down here. These were just used for actually generating a key. When we actually go and click the save private key, that information's already there anyway. So don't be too concerned about the fact that this always defaults to RSA. It's not going to have any impact when we save the new private key as a ppk file. But anyway, now that's all loaded in, we need to actually convert it over to ppk. So we've just got to click save private key. We don't need to do anything with the public key. It already exists. It's already on the server. We just need to click on save private key to convert this into a ppk file that Putty can use. So I'm going to go over to my conversion folder. I'm just going to call this red convert, for example. I'm going to click on save, and then that creates me a ppk file. So if I then go into Putty, I can paste my IP address in, I need to point this actual session that we're doing over to the actual conversion file that I've just created. So I'm going to go over to my conversion folder here, pointed at the thread convert ppk file. We go back up to the session, so we're connecting to the same computer, except we're now using an imported key from Linux, but was created using OpenSSH, and we've converted over into a ppk format that Putty can understand. So I'll click on open now. Again, there was no information in there about what user account to use, so I need to provide that. So I'm going to log in as Fred. And you'll notice this time round how the comment's different. And that's because this is a comment that I'd used in a previous video when I was setting up OpenSSH keys. So I'll put in a password for this particular key, hit return, and there you go. So there is only one actual key created if I just come back to this session, and that's the one that was created through Linux. But as I say, I mean, it's called authorized keys, meaning I could have actually just pasted the public key that we created earlier into this text file, and it would have gone through that process and it would have used that. I suppose it's entirely up to you how you want to deal with it, because with this process that I've done by importing it, converting it, it just means all I need to do is maintain one public key on all of my servers. Whereas if I've got different Windows computers and different Linux computers, and I'm using different keys for Windows versus Linux, I'm going to have to maintain multiple keys on multiple servers. So to me, I think this is the easier strategy to actually use. Pretty straightforward to do. You can even actually export an actual key. There's an option to export it there as well if you want to. So if you've actually created a key with Windows, you can then export it out into a format used by Linux. So that's another option you can do. Now, if you're using a Windows computer to get remote access to a server using SSH, then chances are you're also using WinSCP for file transfers, because this can take advantage of SSH for SFTP or SCP, for example. Now, I'm not going to actually go over the download and installation process, because that's pretty straightforward. I mean, we just click on the download now button, and then we just click on the next download button. It just happens to show you which version is available at that moment in time. One thing I'll point out though is it needs ppk files, because what we want to do is actually set up WinSCP to actually use SSH keys for the authentication, because going forward we won't be able to just use a username and password connect to the server anymore. We need to actually have an SSH key that's going to be accepted on that server. So I've already downloaded and installed the software. The installation process is really easy to do. The only reason I went over it with Putty was just to make sure that you get the puttygen software as well as Putty itself. But in any case, once you've installed it, right at the end it'll ask if you want to import any existing sessions from Putty. So as long as you've actually installed Putty into the default location, it'll find it easily enough. But in my case, I didn't bother with that because my existing session doesn't work anyway. So here we've got WinSCP. So what I need to do is set up a completely new session. So I'm just going to click on the new session option up here. I mean, I could still import the actual existing sessions from Putty if I wanted to, but if I click on Tools and then click on Import Sites there, it gives me a list of existing sessions in Putty, but that session's just not going to work anymore. We're now using a different public key to what that session was set up to work with. So for this particular session, we're going to do SFTP as the file protocol, although there are other options you can use for doing file transfers. I need to give it the name, FQDN or IP address of the server. So that's this is our test server that I've got running at the minute. Now I can put the username in here to make things a bit easier, save me having to go through the actual login process when we connect. But what I do need to do is to actually point this to an actual PPK file, otherwise it's just not going to be able to connect. So I'll click on the advanced button here, and then once that comes up, we go down to the SSH section, down to authentication, and this is where we point it to the actual public key. Now in my case, I've got to actually point it to my converted key. So this is a private key that was basically created in OpenSSH and is now being converted over so that it's in a PPK format that Putty and WinSCP in this case can also use. So we'll tell it to use that particular private key, and I'll click on OK, and then we're going to click on Login. So if it goes and connects, now it's the first time it's connected, so it's going through a security check where it wants you to check the actual fingerprint. So I'm just going to say yes because I know that's the server I want to use. And as you can see here, it's asking for the passphrase for the key fred@templab.land. So I know it's actually going through the process of SSH key authentication. So I'll put the details in for my password. Hopefully I'll be able to put that in correctly. And there it goes. It's now got a session. So the thing to bear in mind is that because we've logged in as a user, effectively we've only got really any control over, say for example, Fred's home directory, because we've logged in as Fred. I mean, we could go further up the chain if we wanted to, but there's going to be areas we can't really touch anyway. I mean, you can go in certain areas, but we can't read them. We can't change things anyway. So that's just something to bear in mind based on who you're actually connecting as. So that's pretty straightforward to actually connect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to disconnect that session. Because, well, what you can do, I mean, although you can actually click on the save button there and save the session details, I mean, I wouldn't recommend saving the actual username with it. What I actually want to do is I actually want to set up a default key. So it doesn't matter which server I connect in using WinSCP. I want to just use the same key going forward because, I mean, I am logged in as a different user. I'm not actually logged into Windows as Fred, but as if I were, it would be a case of I'd always want to be using this key that belongs to Fred anyway to connect to other servers. So in order to actually set that key up as the default key for all sessions going forward, I need to click on the advanced button here to get access to the settings. Go back to our SSH and authentication details here. I'm going to point it at the private key again for Fred. And then I'm going to click on OK. Now, I actually want to save this as a default setting. So I'm going to go to Manage, and then I'm going to click Set Defaults. And as it says there, do you want to set the current settings as the default? So I'm going to click OK. So if I close that, and I'll just come out of WinSCP. So I'll start WinSCP back up again, just to show you. So if I go, well, it automatically opens up and assumes that I want to start a new session. I'll just put in the details of that specific server again. So 172.16.19.229. I'll put in Fred's details. Click on Login. Now, that's the one thing I wanted to point out was the fact that even though I put a password in, that's to do with username and password authentication. So it doesn't have any benefit really putting it in there. It's still prompting me for the passphrase for the key. So I'll put that in, and hopefully again I'll put that in properly. And there we go. We've now got our session set up. So it just means every time we create a new session, if I go down to the advanced option there, and then go down to SSH Key Authentication, you can see this is now going forward the default key. So every time I create a new session, that session's going to be trying to use that PPK file for SSH Key Authentication. So I think that does make life a bit easier. I mean, when you save these sessions, I wouldn't recommend saving the username with it. If you want to save a new session, I mean, it's better to use, the FQDN than what I'm using with IP addresses, but this is just a test server. So you can just click on save. It asks you what do you want to save it as. You can give it a different name. You can set up folders so you can, organize all this. But it just means going forward, I've got sessions that I can keep using. Or again, I can always import them from Putty, for example. I mean, the two tend to go hand in hand. So chances are you've probably connected in using Putty in the first place, in which case you create the session in Putty and then import it in into WinSCP anyway. But it's very easy to set up, and it just means that I've now got a means to connect to the server remotely using Putty, for example, to get command line access using my SSH keys for authentication. But I've always got this option using WinSCP as well, and to do file transfers as well. So the two go hand in hand basically, because WinSCP is dependent on Putty. So pretty straightforward to do. So do hope that's helped. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, because that encourages YouTube's algorithm to suggest it to other people who might find it useful as well. If you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yeah, do subscribe. Just remember to click the little bell icon though, that way you'll get notifications when I send new content out. If you've got any comments, any suggestions, if you want to leave any feedback at all, please post that in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, I've left links to both Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But above all, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.